Today's video, we'll be looking at indirect proofs. So what an indirect proof is it's also called a proof by contradiction. So what we're going to do is we're going to work backwards until we find a contradiction. Okay, so the first step is that you're going to assume the conclusion is false. Like I said, we're working backwards. Then you're going to show that the assumption leads to a contradiction of the hypothesis or some other fact. So basically we're going to contradict the given information. And then we're going to point out that the assumption must be false and therefore the conclusion is true. So what you want to remember from earlier in the year is the hypothesis is the part that you're given, and the conclusion is what you're trying to prove. So if we look at our first example here, I'm given that the measure of angle 1 is not equal to the measure of angle 2, and I want to prove that BD is not an altitude of triangle ABC. So my first step is to assume that the conclusion is false. So the conclusion is what I'm trying to prove. So I'm going to assume that that is false. And so I would assume that BD is an altitude. Of triangle ABC. So then I think about, well, what does that mean? If it's an altitude, then by definition I know it means that the lines have to be perpendicular. So that would mean that BD would have to be perpendicular to AC by the definition of an altitude. And if they're perpendicular, that means I have right angles. So it means that angle 1 and angle 2 would have to be right angles. Because perpendicular lines form 4 right angles. Well, if they're right angles, then that means that they would have to be congruent, because all right angles are congruent. So angle 1 would be congruent to angle 2, because all right angles are congruent. And if my angles are congruent, then that means that my measures are equal, because that's what it means to be congruent. So the measure of angle 1 would have to equal the measure of angle 2 by the definition of congruent segments. But I can see in my given information, I was told that the measure of angle 1 does not equal the measure of angle 2. So that means I've got a contradiction now. This contradicts the given information. And so since it contradicts the given information, our assumption is false. And BD is not an altitude of triangle ABC. Okay, so we'll look now at example 2. We are given that angle 1 is not congruent to angle 2, and we're going to prove that angle 1 is not congruent to angle 4. So again, where we start is at the end, not at the beginning. We're going to assume that our conclusion, or what we're trying to prove, is false. So I start off, I'm going to assume that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. And if I look at my figure, I can see angle 1 and angle 4 are alternate exterior angles. If they're congruent to each other, that would mean that my lines are parallel. Let me label my lines there. So it means line L is parallel to line M by the alternate exterior angle converse. Okay, so if the lines are parallel, then that means that angle 1 and 2 would have to be congruent because they are corresponding angles. So angle 1 would be congruent to angle 2 by the corresponding angles postulate. But that contradicts our given information. Contradicts our given information that angle 1 was not congruent to angle 2. So the assumption is false, and angle 1 is not congruent to angle 4. Okay, so we have one more example. It's very similar. We are given that angle 1 is not congruent to angle 4, and we're going to prove that L is not parallel to M. So on your own, I want you to figure out what the first step is. Write down what you think the first step is. Pause the video and write it down. So hopefully what you wrote down is that you're going to assume that L is parallel to M. Your temporary assumption is going to be that the opposite of what you're trying to prove is true. Okay, so then what can you conclude as a result of L and M being parallel? Can you see something that would contradict what the given information is? Write down what you think the next step is and pause the video. So angle 1 would be congruent to angle 4 by the alternate exterior angles theorem, and at this point we've already contradicted our given information, so we're done. This contradicts the given information. So our assumption is false. And angle 1, oops, looking at the wrong thing there, and L is not parallel to M. That concludes the video. Thank you for watching.